Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Nyman. I'm a principal at Geosyntech Consultants and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's event. The webinar today focuses on DoD-funded research efforts to improve natural resource management by better understanding how disturbance and climate variability impact DoD lands. Dr. Scott Fahrenberg of the University of Montana and Dr. Sasha Reed of the USGS will discuss their assessment of the vulnerability of plant species and communities at dryland installations. And they will present a suite of tools to help DoD land managers predict responses of vegetation and ecological processes to climate change and disturbance. Midway through the presentation, after Sasha presents the problem overview and project objectives, we will pause for a question and answer session. And then we will have another Q&A session after Scott presents the design, results, and conclusions. The next few slides provide some instructions and tips on optimizing your webinar experience. If you haven't done so, you can download Zoom at the link shown here. And if you can't download Zoom, you can still view the slides using a compatible internet browser like Firefox, IE, or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. If you can't view the slides or if your screen freezes, you can always try keying Control and F5 at the same time to perform a hard refresh. This slide is about audio issues. If you have any audio issues, if you're accessing your audio through your computer, you can click the arrow next to the Join Audio button and then select Test Speaker and Microphone and then follow the prompts. And if you continue to experience difficulties, call into the conference line shown here. You can always also submit a comment using the chat box for technical difficulties, but please use that chat box just for comments related to difficulties. The Q&A box should be reserved for questions for the speakers. And in case of continued technical difficulties, you can download a PDF of the slides from the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage and then call into the conference call line. We will also be live streaming the webinar on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here. Today's broadcast is listen only, but we would like you to submit your questions. You can do that by using the Q&A box that should be on your Zoom screen. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit questions in advance. And when you submit your question, please make sure you add your organizational name at the end of your question. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Kurt Preston, who is the SERDP and ESTCP Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resiliency. He has tracked his career between civilian, university, and military positions. Prior to his current position with SERDP, he was a faculty member and a research administrator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he led faculty development efforts to improve research competitiveness. In this position, he also worked with technology transfer personnel, academic departments, and colleges to build university research capability. In addition, Dr. Preston has served as a member of the Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board. Kurt, please proceed.
Why, thank you, Jennifer, and hello, everyone. First, time for a special announcement. I am leaving my post of Resource Conservation Program Manager to lead a new ESTCP area called Climate Resilience. But the Resource Conservation Program will continue to do great work under the leadership of my friend and colleague, Kevin Hires. Onboarding now, Kevin will be in the saddle to introduce himself at the next Resource Conservation webinar. For now, I want to welcome Kevin and express my appreciation for all the speakers who have shared their great SERDP and ESTCP resource conservation funded research over the past 5 years. And as always, I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. The next few slides will provide a quick overview of SERDP and ESTCP. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection, and the Environmental Protection Agency. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on Department of Defense requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impact real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the laboratory and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs, with much of SERDP research occurring at the lab and pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, although occasionally supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are several environmental drivers for the type of work funded by SERDP and ESTCP, with the underlying objective of sustaining Department of Defense ranges, facilities, and operations. This, as you can imagine, is a broad undertaking. It takes the form of looking at maritime sustainability, threatened and endangered species, climate impacts, unexploded ordnance and munitions constituents, as well as other environmental drivers. One key environmental driver is the reduction of current and future environmental liabilities. This involves addressing contamination from the past practices, including impacts to groundwater, soils, and sediments. Unexploded ordnance contamination and developing management approaches for contaminants of emerging concern. The second part of this is pollution prevention, with a focus on eliminating chemicals of concern or hazardous materials in manufacturing, maintenance, and operations of our installations. We have several main focus areas for research and demonstration at SERDP and ESTCP, as shown here. As mentioned earlier, technology transfer is very important within the SERDP and ESTCP programs. Technology transfer efforts include the development of videos, training workshops, and guidance documents. The webinar series, for example, is a substantial component of our technology transfer efforts. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from all of our program areas. Upcoming topics include modeling and monitoring tools to support passive and active non-aqueous phase liquid (NAPL) remediation approaches, unexploded ordnance UXO detection, classification and localization in underwater environments, and others. Registration is open for webinars through early next year. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link. All past webinars are archived and can be assessed using this link. Hey, and don't forget the 2022 SERDP and ESTCP Symposium is coming up. This event will be held November 29th to December 2nd in Arlington, Virginia, and will showcase the latest technologies that enhance the Department of Defense mission through improved environmental and energy performance. Registration is still open. Finally, I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. And as always, I hope you enjoy the webinar today.
Thank you very much, Kurt. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. The presentation today will be given by two speakers. The first portion will be given by Dr. Sasha Reed. Sasha is a biogeochemist at the USGS in Moab, Utah, focused on understanding how the Earth's ecosystems work and how they respond to change. Her primary research interests include drought and increasing temperature impact on ecosystems, diverse energy options for meeting national demand, consequences of exotic plant invasion and ways to combat that, best practices for dealing with wildfire, and novel management options for increased effectiveness and efficiency in restoration and reclamation. Dr. Reed works very closely with a range of collaborators, including federal agency partners. She has a bachelor's degree in organic chemistry from Colgate University and a doctoral degree in biogeochemistry from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Sasha, please proceed.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. And the slides took on a life of their own. Is it okay for me to get us back to where we were going, Jennifer?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'm so sorry, everyone, for the technological problem that I'm sure was my fault. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you. Close your eyes so you don't get a preview of what I want to share with you. I'm really excited to be talking about a project, a SERDP-funded project that we have attempting to understand dryland ecosystems and to think about how Department of Defense land managers can manage for success in these ecosystems, even in times of change. And what I want to do with us today, once I get us back to the right slide, is think about drylands at a larger scale and Department of Defense issues at that scale. And so I will be covering these first two bullets, thinking about why drylands matter and what some of the challenges that we face for them at the global scale, and then thinking about these ecosystems in particular with the Department of Defense needs and the challenges that our DoD managers face. And this is part of the project, as Jennifer said, where we're trying to better understand how drought and physical disturbance, like the type of disturbance we have to do to meet our mission on DoD lands, how we can understand these systems in a climate change context and manage for them. And to do this, we're bringing together long-term observational data, really cutting-edge remote sensing information, and then a set of cross-site climate manipulation experiments that we have in 3 different drylands in the Western US that Scott will talk about as well. And so thinking about drylands at the global scale, they are an enormous set of ecosystems. So drylands are characterized by their dryness, by their aridity. These places have low inputs of water and high demand on that water. And you can see how vast these ecosystems are, making up over 40% of Earth's land surface. These together, drylands represent our planet's largest land biome. Also, billions of people rely on these dryland ecosystems. They are the source of most of our rangelands. They cover these vast areas and provide us with lots of services that we depend upon. And with climate change, drylands are expected to increase in their size. So if you see here, the black line are data collected on the ground, and then the red and blue lines are modeled data about how the spatial extent of drylands may increase with climate change, depending on different ways climate could change. And what you could see here in some of these modeled estimates, drylands could make up almost 57% of Earth's land area by the year 2100. So we really want to better understand these systems and know how to model these systems, because they're already so vast and they're predicted to become even more spatially extensive. These are also already places that can experience extreme conditions like high temperatures and very dry scenarios, and they're getting hotter and drier. We know that climate has been changing, and that warming in the Western United States, where we have many of our drylands, has been exceptionally large. We're also in the midst of a mega drought in the southwestern United States. New estimates suggest that our drylands here are experiencing a drought that they haven't experienced in at least 1,400 years. So really extreme deficits in moisture that the ecosystems have to face and that our land managers have to deal with. So understanding these changes and how the systems will respond to just such changes is especially important. Here you can see these brown trees are pinyon trees, a very dominant type of tree in many Western ecosystems, and they're all dead. We've had massive mortality events in many kinds of dryland ecosystems in response to climate change. This change was suggested to be caused by what's called global change type drought or hot drought. And so there are lots of mortality events across these vast areas. And the trees that are still green here, juniper trees, have also since died in many locations. So understanding how systems may experience state changes in response to climate change is an important part of understanding how we manage for these systems. And we do use these ecosystems a lot. We have a lot of grazing in our Western drylands. We have a lot of Department of Defense lands where we need to prepare for safety, a lot of recreation, energy development, both traditional energy development and alternative energy. You can see my dog Arlo here using drylands. You can see someone enjoying a big desert party, and then a lot of agriculture. And so understanding these ecosystems means understanding how we use them and what the effects of that use are, and how that interacts with climate change. So we often study climate change in drylands or land use in drylands, but we don't typically study them together. But it's really the synergies and the potential complexities of their interactions that could determine the services that our drylands provide and how those services might change when both climate and land use are occurring at the same time, the changes in those systems. And we have different ways we think that climate and physical disturbance could interact. So here, if you think of an ecosystem variable on this vertical axis, maybe like forage availability for wildlife and livestock. And with a drought, with an increased frequency or severity of drought that we're seeing with climate change, we might expect that forage availability to go down. When we put disturbance on top of that, maybe there's a big physical disturbance event here where this vertical line is, we might expect that two hard things make the system even more challenged, right? So we have a much steeper, further decline in that ecosystem variable like forage. But in contrast to that, we could find scenarios in which two wrongs could make a right, where we have a disturbance and then potentially because there's less competition among the plants, or we get a fast change in community that's better adapted to drought conditions, or perhaps other resources in the soils are released, we could see the opposite pattern. And we just don't know in drylands because we have so very few studies looking at how dryland ecosystems respond. At the same time, the managing of these systems is hugely important, and stakeholder values are complicated, and we need to take into consideration our neighbors and our partners in these decision-making. We also have these systems, these dryland systems that have chronic water limitation. Indeed, they're defined by their lack of water, and then also have very low fertility soils. So there's not a lot of soil resource there. This can increase the vulnerability of plants to things like climate change and land use and their interaction. It could promote wholesale changes to these ecosystems, and it could decrease the success of restoration efforts, making a manager's job that much harder. And what we're thinking about in part is kind of the timing of resource availability. So if you imagine this line, the blue line represents water availability, and the higher you are, the more you have. So you've got a lot of water here, that water availability goes down, but then goes back up. The second resource could represent something like nutrient availability, and it might have a different pattern. And with something like plant growth, we could expect that we need both of these resources to be available to see success. And so one of the things that we've been able to do with this project is think about how multiple resources co-vary in space and time. So if you look just at this A part of the figure here, this is a paper that we wrote as a part of this project. We see that there's a resource, and we could imagine this might be nutrient availability. Perhaps this second resource that's becoming available could be seed abundance. The third resource, water availability, that if we can time our restoration efforts, maybe adding seeds at a time when the resources occur, we could have higher success. And if we could get all three resources to occur together, we might see much higher success in restoration efforts than we've ever been able to achieve in a lot of these challenging drylands. And so this is part of what we're trying to understand with this project is how do ecosystems get affected by climate and land use change together, and how could we use that knowledge to understand the availability of resources that managers could rely upon for things like restoration success after use. And we have a lot of managers who need and are asking for information like this in the Western US, where we have huge public land, extensive categories, including Department of Defense installations here. These are dryland ecosystems. These are systems that are experiencing significant change, and that we need better tools and better knowledge to be able to inform how we manage these systems into the future. And so a big part of this project is trying to understand that for DoD. Again, here you can see these large Department of Defense installations, and indeed 70% of DoD installations are located in areas categorized as drylands. These lands are such special habitats. You can see here the number of species that would be related to the the imperiled species and the Endangered Species Act species. They're much higher on DoD lands, and that's because the Department of Defense is really a preserve for imperiled and endangered species in many ways. And so how can we do justice to these organisms in the face of climate change to keep them safe, keep these numbers high on DoD lands? And DoD managers have the challenging job of balancing meeting our mission, the important uses on DoD lands, with the ecological health. And so that's our goal with this project, is to be able to provide that information for drylands. So one key example is dust. Here on the left, you can see a huge dust storm moving across Phoenix. It can be apocalyptic here in the Southwest sometimes. It can rain mud. We have a lot of dust. And so with drought and with soil destabilization from land use, we are expecting increases in dust production. And this is important not only for our neighbors, things like Phoenix having to reroute planes. Dust is actually the second largest cause of vehicular death in Arizona, but it also affects things farther away like water balance. Here you can see this dust moves onto snowpack in our mountains, changes the energy balance and the way that the snow melts. and actually results in us losing water in these already dry places. So we want to think about services like soil stabilization and creative ways that we can help DoD really leading the Western United States and drylands in general in managing these landscapes. And so thinking about that is important not only because of the people who live there, but we know that climate change in drylands in particular can be linked to increased conflict, and with lowered resources and changing world, we can have humans more challenged by this, resulting in more conflict. We also know that drylands are a critical part of feeding back into climate change through changes to the carbon cycle. Here you can see that drylands make up more than a third of organic carbon and almost 85% of the inorganic carbon stored in soils. So if drylands change and respond to the interactive effects of climate and land use change, we could expect that to further feedback to affect our future climate in ways that we're trying to understand. So that was the overview that I wanted to give you, just kind of that bigger picture. And now we can move into Scott, and he'll talk much more specifically about the project and about the results that we've seen so far. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sasha. And we'll pause here for a couple of questions from the audience on Sasha's portion of the presentation. To our audience, if you have any questions, please type them into Zoom now using the Q&A box. To start with, Sasha, if the drought and the warming temperatures continue, will the drylands cross some kind of threshold where we would expect to see rapid changes in plant communities or other aspects of the ecosystems?
Yes, that is an excellent question. We think they will in many places, that we will start to see, instead of kind of slow changes that we have more time to combat, much more rapid changes and kind of threshold type responses. And so part of what we're trying to understand is how can we get some early warning indicators of that kind of change, and what options might we have for kind of creative management in the face of that change. So we are seeing and expect to continue to see pretty rapid changes in many of our drylands ecosystems that were kind of already living on the edge. And we're trying to better understand those changes, predict when those changes will happen, and provide some management options in the face of that change.
Great, thank you, Sasha. To follow up on that, do you expect specific challenges or opportunities for the Department of Defense when it comes to increased management of carbon on national lands?
Oh my gosh, that's a really exciting question. I think the Department of Defense has phenomenal opportunities to help us start sequestering carbon on public lands. And this is something that we're also working with the Bureau of Land Management and other federal land agencies to better understand, not that the kind of managing of carbon would ever become our top goal, but there are so many co-benefits associated with managing for carbon. And as we saw in those maps of the United States and of the world, drylands are so vast and such a dominant part of the carbon cycle. If we could start actively managing to sequester more carbon on our DoD lands, I think we could have incredible impact for our nation in being able to combat climate change.
Great, thanks. And just to clarify, by sequestering carbon, do you mean through things like trees and plants?
Excellent. Yes, thank you. Yes, that's what I mean. I mean, getting plants to take up more carbon, and then we store more carbon in our soils than in our plants and the atmosphere combined. So soils are actually also a wonderful reservoir for storing and sequestering carbon. And dryland plants are particularly interesting because they put a lot of their carbon below ground, where it can be safer and last longer, be stored and sequestered longer. So drylands offer some pretty special opportunities to not only sequester in plants, if we can help plants grow, especially perennial plants, but if we can get that carbon below ground where it can be safe for long, long periods of time.
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Sasha. And Sasha will come back at the end of the webinar to answer more questions as well.
Wonderful.
So now we'll move to our second speaker, Dr. Scott Fahrenberg, an ecologist at the University of Montana in Missoula. Scott focuses on understanding how rapidly changing environments affect the composition and dynamics of native plant and animal communities. Much of his research also centers on water-limited ecosystems in the Western United States. He uses a combination of field experiments and quantitative methods to look at the sensitivity and responses of native and invasive species to climate change and a range of disturbance types. Scott has a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's degree in entomology from the University of Maryland, and a doctoral degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Scott, please go ahead.
All right, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Sasha, thank you for that great introduction. It gave me a chance to get fully caffeinated, so I'm ready to run. And just sort of coming out of what Sasha just told us about the importance of drylands, both globally in terms of the Earth system and also to understanding the goals of the DoD, I want to talk more specifically about our project. And the big picture of our project objective was to quantify the vulnerability of drylands to drought and disturbance. We did that using a multi-site assessment approach where experiments were put on the ground in 3 different dryland types, as Sasha mentioned. And we combined that with the use of long-term data, primarily remote sensing layers, in order to do a better understanding of how our localized experiments were capturing variation that might happen at larger regional to continental scales. Ultimately, what we wanted to do with our project is to deliver important outcomes for the managers of DoD installations, which could include things like geospatially refined predictions of change, anticipated transformations of the native plant community or soil organisms, and potentially work with them even on strategies for adapting their management going forward to address these anticipated changes. So our locations were across the Western US. From north to south, we were working in the Great Basin Desert in Idaho at the Orchard Combat Training Center, which is a cold semi-arid system. We move a little further south to Nevada to the Nevada National Security Site, which is in the Mojave Desert just south of the Great Basin ecotone. That's considered a warm desert. And finally, we move all the way down to the border in southern New Mexico in the Chihuahuan Desert, where we're working on the Jornada Experimental Range, which shares a boundary with Fort Bliss, which was our original targeted location. And we're working there in the Chihuahuan Desert. Now, these different climate types, as we move across the West, imply that we're going to find different varieties of species and different forms and functions in those ecosystems. And this is one of the reasons why we wanted this latitudinally dispersed set of experiments. So we could cross conditions that were not only climatic, but also in the local communities that we would expect to work with there. When we speak about these different Köppen climate classifications, what we're really referring to in drylands is the timing of precipitation relative to peak temperature. These are all dry systems, and while they get different total levels of precipitation, the timing with which that rainfall or snow enters the system relative to the peak summer temperature in the northern hemisphere can be quite different. So in the north, we see a winter recharge of precipitation and a peak in summer temperature. So that allows that moisture to hang around for quite a while and work its way into the soil in that Great Basin location. Whereas we go to the Mojave, we have a consistent background of very low levels of precipitation in a very warm summer. So there's not a lot of recharge before you get to that peak window. And in the Jornada Experimental Range location, that's a monsoonally driven system where we see peak precipitation coinciding with peak temperature. So while there's a lot of potential for rapid green up and functioning, there's a really short window with which peak biomass can be put on because the temperature is driving a lot of evaporative transpiration. On the ground in our 3 locations, we installed a full factorial field experiment where we introduced experimental disturbance with drought and the interaction of the 2 along with control plots. We had 10 plots in each local site, so 40 total plots in a location, 120 across the entire network of experiments. And in each of these, we measured a suite of vegetation and soil measurements that allowed us to understand change as a function of our treatments. A little more specifically about those treatments, the drought is a 1 in 100 year event. That is applied using a passive interception system. We're looking at a downward view of one in the Chihuahuan Desert. So those are clear acrylic slats that intercept rainfall, push it off to a gutter, and they run out through hoses off of the plot, which is 3 by 5 meters. And the disturbance, in order to keep it uniform and to mimic tracked vehicle traffic, was performed by 3 passes with a quad, pulling a 425-pound spike roller. Technically, that roller is a little heavier once we put in the weight of the bars and the wheels. So we see Sam Jordan driving across our plots, 3 equal passes across each. And he is in this picture, he's driving over a mesquite shrub. And so you can kind of see a shrub sticking out from under the quad wheels there. So we smash down all the vegetation regardless of size in the plots. In addition to that on the ground experimentation, Sasha mentioned that we used a lot of long-term and remotely sensed data. And one of those products that we used pretty heavily was the Landsat record, which now goes back over 40 years. We have primarily focused on metrics of productivity out of that Landsat record. And one of the really interesting and exciting pieces of our project, which is led by Tyson Terry and Peter Adler at Utah State University, is the use of pipelines across the Western United States. So pipelines are a uniform type of disturbance that have been placed across hundreds and hundreds of miles of landscape across drylands. And Tyson has done the painstaking work of pulling out the remote sensing pixels that correspond to those pipelines in neighboring areas that were not disturbed when it was installed. If we look at this photo in the lower right, the pipeline is occurring under that sparse vegetation that sort of originates from the lower left-hand corner. And that was soil pulled away, the pipeline was put in place, the soil is pushed back over, and we're looking at the vegetation that is recovered since the timing of that disturbance. And then we have an access road, which is very clear, sitting down the middle. And if we look far to the right and far to the left of those 2 types of disturbance, you see those more natural locations that have not been impacted. And this is what Tyson is trying to do, is get that pipeline and find one of those neighboring pixels that in that natural area. So he has a great paired design. And he can now, because he knows when pipelines were placed, he can look back at how long they've been there and assess the level of recovery from that Landsat record. Okay, I'm going to jump into our results. Now, if you feel confused or lost from me running through that experimental design, I'll remind you of where everything comes from while I'm going through it. And I'm going to take a sidestep on a tangent when I'm giving results into a small scale experiment that was a companion of this, just because I like to keep it interesting. So when I do that sidestep, I'll let you know. But what I'm going to focus on from the SERDP specific field experiments is the plant and soil responses to those treatments. And then I'm going to talk about that timeline to recovery along those pipelines that Tyson has. Now, this is a small subset of the data we have. We're a very data-rich project, and we would have to be here all day to really run through it. But hopefully this gives you a window of what we're working with and where we're heading. I'm going to start with a photo. Worth 1,000 words, as the adage goes. And we're looking at the Chihuahuan Desert, and this is 1 year after the treatments are installed, and this is one of our disturbed plots. And I have put a box, that black box is running around a mesquite shrub. And we can see that around that shrub, the disturbance has indeed had an effect on the other portions of the vegetation community. We've lost a lot of native bunch grass from driving that quad and spike roller over that plot. And the shrub seems to have done pretty well for itself. And I show this image because in this case, you can walk up to a plot in this Chihuahuan Desert site, and we can tell what we've done to it, and we can see the impact the disturbance had. But it hasn't been that simple across all the sites. And one of the reasons is we move across our sites, we're dealing with different functional types and species of plants. So I want to prime us to think this way when we go through the rest of the results. We're focused on perennial shrubs, and I'll describe those species when I move forward. And those perennial shrubs that are at the center of our plots range from being deciduous in the south to evergreen at the 2 northern sites, or more northern sites. But these communities also have forbs and grasses, and they can be annual or perennial. And some of these sites have a large number of exotic plants that can potentially occur. And this is all contextualizing the outcomes of our experiment. And one of the reasons why we felt like we needed multiple sites and multiple years of following them to really understand what might happen. The first set of results I'm going to show you are a simple metric of photosynthetic capacity of these plants. So what we're seeing on the slides, or on these graph panels, is net carbon dioxide assimilated by these shrubs inside a chamber where we have controlled the atmospheric conditions to standardize it for all plants, which allows us to compare among plants, across years, and across sites. The different colored symbols and shapes are our treatments, and the different panels represent our locations. Starting in the north in the Idaho Great Basin site, we're dealing with sagebrush. And when we move south, we're dealing with creosote in the Mojave, and then a mesquite-dominated landscape in the Chihuahuan Desert. The mesquite is that deciduous perennial, and the other two are evergreen shrubs. What we also notice when we're looking at this photosynthesis data is a lot of variation. It bounces around. So there's a lot of variation within treatments, a lot of variation over time. And what we're seeing is the effect of background annual climate. Whenever it dries out in these systems, total photosynthetic capture by all the shrubs drops. And so we can really see that in the northernmost site, the Idaho sagebrush site, that 2020 and 2021 are quite dry relative to the start of the experiment in 2019. And we can see that shrubs, regardless of treatment, are capturing less carbon dioxide. We really see it when we get down to the Mojave, and we have a missing year because of a COVID-related travel restriction, but we see the creosote really drops off as it goes into a multiple drought years. And what we really can secondly pull out after all that variability that's just background natural response to the climate is that the treatments have not had much of an effect on the photosynthetic capacity of creosote or mesquite in our two southernmost sites. So while there's variability, the treatments aren't really distinguishing themselves as driving level of capture up or down. But that's not the same for the sagebrush. We can see up here on the top panel that the control plots are doing a little bit better than the disturbance. And both of the drought plots have been sitting quite low throughout this experiment. And we have data for 2022, which isn't on here. It takes quite a while to clean this data, but this is a continuation of these trends. I want you to remember this image that things are dropping off in this northernmost site because there's a drought happening in this site while we're doing our experiment. So our drought is happening on top of drought, which means it may not be having the effect that you want to, it may not be having a large effect. It makes it more difficult for us to understand what drought might mean in this system. Again, why we need multiple years and multiple sites. Okay, that last bit of data is just about carbon capture by those shrubs. That's one metric of performance, and it tells us something about those focal shrubs. But there's a whole plant community, if we remember that downward facing photo, and we lost quite a bit of that with the disturbed plot in the Chihuahuan Desert. So I want to show you a full comparison of plant communities across these sites. And what we're looking at here are ordinated data. It's multivariate data. And if you're not used to looking at this, give me a moment to describe how to understand these panels, and then we'll walk through what they tell us. Each symbol on one of these panels represents a sample. And a sample in this experiment is a set of information collected along transects in each plot that tells us the variety of plants, so the species and their frequencies. So you have a matrix of information that turns into a single plot marker on this figure, or sorry, a single symbol marker on this figure. Two symbols that are close together are very similar in the plant species and abundance patterns that they have, and two that are far apart are more different. You can become different in two ways. You can have very different species, so you can have totally different plant communities and sit far apart on the panel. Or you can have the same species, but in very different frequencies. So what's common in one plot would be rare in another, and vice versa. So that would drive symbols apart as well. And what we can see, I'm just going to keep us to 1 year's worth of response, and I'm only going to show panels for 2 of the sites, or I would suddenly overwhelm us in multivariate data, is that at the Nevada National Security Site in the Mojave, we had a large effect. Our treatments all had a large effect of driving those different treatment groups away from the control. So we're seeing the control plot here. Unfortunately, the colors change here, but we see the control plot and everything else sort of drifting away. And I'll tell you that our southernmost site in the Chihuahuan Desert had a very similar panel, so I'm only showing one for that reason. What I have done, because this is noisy and hard to look at, is I have calculated where the means of these multivariate data sit, and I've scaled some lines so that you can just look at these symbols. These double-headed arrows tell you the change in multivariate means that are caused by disturbance versus drought, which is the yellow double-headed line. Now, this is not a hard and fast, let's say this is not a very quantitative way of looking at it, but it gives us a general way of looking at this complicated data. And what we can see is that drought and disturbance both had pretty large impacts in the Nevada National Security Site, creosote-dominated community. And we can see why is the disturbance arrow is pointing this way, because we'll see both of the disturbance plots sitting up here and the drought and control down low. So this axis is associated with that. And the drought has pushed things to the left, drought and drought, away from control and disturbance. It doesn't matter that the orientation of the arrows have changed because you can rotate ordinations. What we really need to walk away from this figure understanding is that in that Idaho Great Basin site, the change caused by disturbance is quite large, similar in scale to what we saw on our southern sites, but we're not getting much of a drought response in the full community, despite the focal shrub doing very poorly with carbon capture. So when we think about this from a community perspective versus an individual species perspective, we really get a different picture. But we also have to remember that if we were tempted to tell someone that the Great Basin communities are not sensitive to drought because of this small change, that we're doing our experiment in a time of drought. So the effect we can have is minimized. It's fire on fire, so to speak. And so we have to remember that we need more years and more time before we can fully quantify sensitivity to drought in that location. All right, this is the tangent I warned you about that I was going to take us on a sidestep. And I have a reason for this, and I hope it becomes clear as I describe. But this is a companion experiment that the subset of our SERDP team set up in the Chihuahuan Desert next to our SERDP location. And the goal of this experiment was to ask, what is the importance of vegetation cover versus soils for plant community performance? We completed this experiment using a factorial reciprocal transplant, a very classic design in ecology and evolution. And what we did is we went out and we found intact shrubs that were of equal size, and we trimmed one off at the ground, and we left the other one standing. And we went out and we found an open area that didn't have any vegetation, and we left some as they were, and in other cases put a shade cloth across them to mimic shrub cover. We also moved soil around. Soil that started out under a shrub got moved out into the open, and soil from out in the open was brought in under shrubs in a reciprocal design. So we can now disentangle cover from soil provenance. Now in drylands, it's often common that you can find plants aggregating together. So for a long period of time, people have said facilitation amongst plants is really high in dry environments. But as Sasha was pointing out, resources can be quite sparse and infrequent. So the converse of this is that if you are occurring close to your neighbors, when you need those resources, competition could skyrocket. And so what moderates the balance between facilitation and competition remains poorly understood in drylands globally, even though we have some really important guiding hypotheses. And this experiment steps into that arena. This is what it looks like on the ground. It's not really impressive, so to speak, when you just see it. This is just a shade cloth over a structure, which gives a really uniform level of about 70% solar radiation reduction to mimic heavy shrub cover. And these open areas that we would see off to the side have had some vegetation pop up because this photo is taken after the monsoon in a wetter year. So we can see these open areas can have vegetation. Those annual plants can come out of the seed bank where they've been dormant and sitting out bad weather and climate conditions. And then they can put their seeds back down and go dormant for some period of time. What did we find? I'm going to try to simplify this by showing you these standardized beta weights, and you don't need to know how beta weights are calculated. You only need to know that they're a standardized measure that allow for apples to apples comparisons across different groups or different effects that are in the model. And what I'm going to show you is the effect of the covers, shading, shrub, and trimmed relative to that open interspace where there is no cover at all, and the effect of having occurring in shrub-related soil, so soil that derived from being near a shrub versus being out in the interspace. And I'm going to show you 2 of 3 years of data that we have right now. The first year is a severe drought for the system in the Chihuahuan Desert, and the second is an above average rainfall year. So we had back-to-back extreme years. And we can see that if we stopped after year 1, we would have walked away thinking that shrubs didn't have a very large effect. Soil provenance in trimming. So this is a shrub is missing, but we still have shrub soil in this treatment. And they both sit a little to the right of that intact shrub, which would suggest to us that soil is really important, but something about the shrub is holding things down, even though we wouldn't call these different. And the shading just popped, which is okay. So in this case, the effect of the shade that a shrub casts would be beneficial, but something about the presence of the shrub, if we were hand waving, would have depressed that. But luckily we kept doing this multiple years. Because as soon as we added some resource to the system, like Sasha pointed out with those multiple peaked diagrams, we suddenly had the combination of soils and water together. And we see that shading and shrubs just boom with vegetation. that being in that soil without the shrub is still good for you because that soil is more fertile than out in the open. And being in that shrub soil, regardless of where it is now, when we moved it around, is really good. And we should note the interval. If we put these on the same axes, everything from 2021 would sit far to the right of 2020. So everything exploded in a positive way that benefited the plant community when we added some moisture, showing us that it is important to consider the timing and duration of these experiments in these systems. Okay, I'm off of the tangent. I'm back onto the main SERDP, and I'm going to show you one last panel from the field experiment, which is the soil metrics from the Chihuahuan Desert. And this is an assessment of what's happened over a short interval of the experiment. And what we're looking at are standardized responses, the relative change. If the bar goes negative, it means that that treatment has less of that value or less of that metric than the control plots. And if it goes positive, it means we've boosted it in those treatments. We're looking at organic carbon, dissolved nitrogen, and microbial biomass as we move left to right respectively. And if we weren't able to see the right-hand panel, if that microbial biomass was blotted out and we were just focused on the left, we would think that we have seen we think we would be able to explain this. So we see that organic carbon and nitrogen increase with droughting because the two drought with the disturbance interaction. When the drought is happening, or when a drought is happening, we expect microbial communities to be less active, and therefore they eat less organic carbon. And when a drought is happening, we expect plants to scale back, like we saw in that photosynthetic data that I started out with. So they're leaving more nitrogen in the soil, and not pulling as much up in their roots. Just two of the mechanisms that affect these pools. And we expect those things to build up a bit whenever it's dry, because the pull down on those is moderated or reduced. And we would argue in this case, if we didn't know anything about microbial biomass, that disturbance reduced these pools possibly by priming the microbial community or maybe through some other mechanism. And when we start to see the microbial data, it starts to make us think a little harder. We have negatively impacted microbial communities in the soil with all three of these treatments. And that would still help us to explain why there's a buildup of organic carbon, but it wouldn't really help us to explain this reduction in this when it comes to the disturbance. There's less microbes, so why do we have less of their food source sitting around? So this is something I wanted to use this result to illustrate the need to think more systematically in the system. We have to be systems ecologists. And so the possibilities here is that mixing the soil has led to a loss of nitrogen and carbon through gassing, outgassing, through leaching, through erosion, any variety of mechanisms that could have also been a turnover in the microbial community to a group of microbes that somehow use more of this material and somehow prime plant activity. We need to think of all of that. And that's my segue into the summary of the field experimental work, which is that the drought and disturbance impacts varied with the climate regime and with the interannual climate that we were dealing with. Rates of photosynthesis were not strongly affected in 2 of the 3 shrubs. And I didn't mention while showing you that panel, our 2 southernmost sites with creosote and mesquite have shrubs that are strongly adapted to drought. They're known drought tolerators. And we can also go out and chop them off and they will resprout from the root mass. So they have a history that have evolved life history that deals with disturbance really well. If we chop a sagebrush off, we end up with a dead stump. And they are also known to occur in wetter, cooler microsites. So it fits with what we know about the evolution of these shrubs, that they would respond the way they did in terms of photosynthesis. What really was important is that when we got dug deeper into these systems to understand the full community responses, we found that the full communities were affected in variable ways across the sites, that germination has benefited from shrub cover and shading. And we have not worked that into our data, but we do have Cartesian plane information about our experiment, so we can ask where all of our samples are relative to other plants. And finally, in the big picture, just to keep us moving along, a systems view is required for linking all of this information. We have all of this data on the table, taken at different timescales and in different ways, and we somehow have to bring it together if we want to give a full picture to the managers. Okay, just a couple more results slides, and then we'll be on to some summary and the Q&A. I mentioned earlier that experiment, that data set that Tyson Terry and Peter Adler from Utah State are working with as part of our group, which involved those pipelines. And I showed you the photo of the pipeline disturbance next to that road in natural areas. So if we can pull that to mind, in addition to tracing those pipelines across the West in the remote sensing and GIS layers, Tyson broke down the area over which he was using pipelines from. Of course, they occur nationally, but he's using a small set of the West, which would be categorized as dryland. He broke those drylands down into climate zones like I described before. Cold, cool, and warm is the categorizations he used for simplicity in these figures. And so this would correspond to our Great Basin type site, the cold, and our Mojave site, which sits in these warm zones. You can see this warm area in Nevada, but he also has cool deserts in addition to our warm southern deserts and our cold northern. What he discovered, before I try to walk us through the panels, is that the cooler the system, the more rapidly and the higher rate they recover in their net primary productivity. So total productivity tends to increase in the cooler zones after disturbance more rapidly than in the warmer. And the warmer systems recover their shrubs to a greater degree than the cooler systems, but they don't recover their productivity. And we'll walk through these figures and I'll explain some of the reasons why. We're looking at years since disturbance, so he knows, if we remember, he knows when the pipelines were installed. There's great records of this. And then he can pick up in the Landsat record at some period of time after. So there are some things when he's in the Landsat record that will allow him to go out to about 100 years post-disturbance, right? So he has about 40 years or 45 years of that window of time to go back, and then he can model this in a really interesting way. We're looking at the percent sites recovered. So in his study, sites are the various pixels that he's working with along his remote sensing record. And we're looking at the recovery of shrub cover versus productivity total. So greenness and biomass is what we're looking at over here on the right-hand side. And the proportion of that would be shrubs is what we can think of on the left-hand side. We see that the warm sites, as the bullet said, recovered more shrubs than the cool and the cold site. And when we think about total productivity, the coldest site is back to about 85 to 90% productivity of what it would be relative to the undisturbed. But the cooler and the warmer site are sitting quite low and have not yet made it back. And the warm sites are doing really poorly. Total productivity in those sites remains less than a quarter on average of the undisturbed. What's happening here? Well, in the colder site, there are invasive grasses. So remembering back to that need to think of functional types, there have been a lot of exotic invasives introduced into these deserts from feedstocks and other pathways. And in these colder sites, an example of a plant that is causing this boom in NPP that allows them to recover is cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum. So these sites are green when we look at them in the Landsat record, but it's not the native community that's returning. How do you have all these shrubs returning in a warm zone, but still have such low productivity? Well, they're different shrubs is what Tyson has discovered from ground truthing and working through the layers. So these sites have recovered shrubs, but they're not the same species of shrubs that were there prior to the disturbance. So while they have infilled and they have covered a similar amount of area, they are not as productive yet in this 100-year timeline as what was there before. This is really interesting for so many reasons, but one of the things I want to remind you of is if this was a mesic forest in New England, we could have cut this forest down 2 to 3 times in this 100-year interval and been back to a similar level of biomass we started with. And this illustrates that long recovery time that's needed when drylands are really heavily impacted, like a pipeline disturbance, and highlights the need, like Sasha was saying, for thinking about how we might push this along through strategically thinking about resource availability. One more seemingly complicated but truly simple figure about the pipelines is that soil type matters. And soil scientists all over the world would have said, yes, we knew that already. But it's important here that we are able to contextualize the role of soil in relation to climate, which in this case is variability in mean annual precipitation across the pipelines. And the values that we're seeing on the figures are a ratio of disturbed to undisturbed productivity, or NPP. So if the value is above 1, it means the disturbed areas have more productivity than the undisturbed natural area nearby. And if it goes below, it means that undisturbed natural area has higher productivity than the disturbed, right? That's the ratio. We're looking at productivity recovered, and you can see that in the cold, cool, and warm deserts, there's similar patterns. And I apologize for the red and green coloring for those who might not pick it up, but the steepest negative line is 55% sand content from this legend on the right. And the steepest positive line across all panels is the lowest level, 37% sand content. So this is a range of soil texture based on sandiness. And we can see that across all of these systems, as we go from dry to wet, the higher the sand content, the lower the recovery of NPP. In the lower category of sand content, the higher the recovery of NPP. I'm not going to pull us into the world of the inverse texture hypothesis of drylands, but for those of you who are dryland scientists who might be watching, this does conform to those predictions made by that hypothesis. And so it tells us that we have to not only think about background climate, the species that are present, their evolved functional types and forms, but also the soils in which they're occurring on top of interannual climate variation. It creates a very systems-driven need and view of these systems. So the summary of that work that Tyson and Peter are leading up is that precipitation timing, that seasonality that he summarized as cool, cold, and warm, greatly affected recovery across those latitudes or locations in some cases were elevational. Systems can recover shrubs or their productivity, but they don't recover both equally. And very few of them made it back to levels that were akin to the undisturbed, even after 100 years. The warmer systems experience high turnover in the shrub species, and that is still greatly affecting their productivity, their ability to capture carbon, move it into biomass, and get it below ground. That would also in some ways affect the propensity of the system to hold water and resist erosion. The cool systems recover their productivity, but primarily from invasive grasses. And that comes with another problem that's not revealed in this data, is that those invasive grasses can lead to alternate disturbance regimes. Cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, is notorious for having created a higher fire frequency in the Great Basin than would have historically been common. And if we remember, I mentioned earlier, sagebrush doesn't deal well with disturbance. So if we increase the burning frequency or severity of that location, it's going to have a negative impact on that foundational species. And finally, the sandy soils benefited recovery at low precipitation, but not at high, which again illustrates the need for us to think about localized context not only for trying to explain those plots, but for productivity at a global scale in relation to climate change and disturbance. Okay, the big picture conclusions. We just want people when we leave today to understand if you didn't think that climate change would affect drylands, well, it can. And a lot of people think that it won't, because when they think dryland, they think hot desert. So they think dry and hot. How can something that's adapted to being dry and hot suffer from being dry and hot? Well, the answer is there's still such a thing as drought in drylands, and we can see that it's having an effect on the vegetation communities and other measures. Disturbances can compound these effects, but it's not in a way that would be easily predicted. Disturbance isn't immediately a negative thing. It's really contextualized as to what portion of the organismal community we're focused on and over what time frames. The outcomes that we are seeing, both in our short-term experimental data and in those long-term Landsat records, both in Tyson's work, but also in the work of our broader group, is that everything varies with background climate regime, interannual climate variation, soils, and plant types. That's really not a surprise. We suspected that as ecologists from the start, but getting data that allows us to quantify the variability linked to each of these different mechanisms or different factors still remains very important, because that's what's lacking in our ability to support our ability to give forecasts to managers. Forecasting responses requires a lot of data synthesis. We need to pull all of this data together. If we looked at this through just one of these lenses, it would be like speaking to the community of managers and scientists, like peeking through a mail slot in the door, instead of just opening the door. So instead of trying to install a few more mail slots to get a little bit more of a view, we need to be creative in a way that we pull all this data together to pull that door fully open so that we can share the full story. And we hope that our study will be yet one more model for advancing that effort into a synthesis effort that speaks to the scientists and the managers in a cohesive and quantitative way. And I wanted to use this as a segue back to the future direction. Ultimately, what we were trying to do and still want to do is help managers on the ground. That's the mission that Sasha works under. and it's the mission that we have made at the core of this project. So we want to pool all of these efforts, on-the-ground experiments, remote sensing, the modeling, into a framework and a delivery mode that allows the managers to actually interface with it and feel like they're getting useful information that will help them to make decisions and help them to think about how to use limited resources going forward. So ultimately, we want to get there, and we've had a great group of managers on the ground that we've worked with. And so with the benefits to the DoD, one of the benefits to us has been working with the DoD, because we've had this really insightful group of people that help to inform our project. But thinking about what we want to give back to the DoD, to say the least, managing a dryland is challenging when it's DoD trying to make sure they're maintaining readiness and dealing with all of that important environmental and ecological information that Sasha shared. It becomes an overwhelming task. We hope our work is providing critical information to those managers. We want to help them to forecast so that we can inform the use decisions and how they might use their resources when they're trying to manage and restore. And finally, we're hoping that quantifying those recovery rates and timing, like we do with that pipeline data, can really help to shape strategy now and into the future across these systems. This has been a great team. It's a big team. So I didn't mention all of these people, but we wouldn't function. Every single person here has played a key role at some point in time. And so it's been a strong team effort, and we're missing a few people as well from this picture. And I really want to just acknowledge our on the ground folks from our 3 locations. And these aren't the only people that have helped us, but really Charlie Baum, Derek Hall, and John Anderson have all played an incredible role of helping us get these experiments done and think about local issues that we otherwise would have struggled through. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. I'm ready for the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. And our audience can now ask questions of Scott or Sasha by typing them in by clicking on the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. So to start with, Scott, we saw definitely changes from disturbances. Are there scenarios where disturbances to plant cover might have a positive impact that could improve resilience or resistance to drought?
Yeah, there are, and it's a really great question, and something that we were struck by going into this is that for these plant species, and we can use the example from what I just showed of mesquite, those mesquite shrubs in the southern New Mexico Chihuahuan Desert. They're highly adapted to disturbance, and so if we remove above ground biomass, they still have a functioning live root system that would have been there supporting much more above ground biomass. So the reality is they have a lot of resources banked away below ground. And if they don't have to maintain the above ground biomass during a drought, they tend to come back up and sprout much more vigorously and be more healthy as they're coming back. So in those cases, there are times when having above ground biomass reduced allowed those individuals to do a better job through drought periods. And that's just something that's going to be determined by the evolutionary history and the history of disturbances and climate of a location. So yes, there are times when disturbance can be, maybe not say good, but it's not bad, and it can lead to at least some individuals in the community doing better than we might have expected.
Okay, thank you. The next question has to do with the Chihuahuan Desert site. Is there Russian thistle on or near your plots? And if so, was there a response by that species?
Yeah, great question. And luckily for us, no, there is no Russian thistle in either of these 2 locations. It has not yet made it into this section of the Jornada experimental range where either of these experiments are taking place. And in fact, we have not seen any serious frequency of invasive species in that southern site yet. And partly that site has been protected from grazing by cattle for quite some time, which is one of the reasons why we're using it. It helps us to not have to put up large fences. So that's likely one of the things that makes this site different than other areas in the Chihuahuan Desert and the broader landscape where grazing is still happening. And so I wish I could speak to that, and I'm glad we don't have to in our results, but we know that Russian thistle and love grass and other things are a serious issue, but we haven't had to deal.
Okay. You showed multivariate analysis around slide 53 or so. Can you summarize what variables or factors were considered in that and why those metrics were selected?
Yeah, so that multivariate data is just plant types and frequency. So it's species data and frequency of those species in this case. And it's collected along transects that are placed across each of those experimental plots. And we've done that every year. So in this case, it's the species information is a yes, no, is it there? And if it's there, it's a count of how many times it shows up along those transect lines. We did this before we ever started our experiment, and I think I was running too fast to say this. The reason I'm showing the pre-treatment is we put a lot of energy into making sure that the plot started out with a set of communities that were very similar. And so we have this shotgun blast of pre-treatment, which shows that we did pretty good at that. And so we didn't have any a priori distinguishing community features amongst the groups that led to the outcomes we're seeing post-treatment. And we did the same for shrub properties. And so while the shrub properties themselves are not in this, we went out and made sure that we had similar shrub shapes and sizes as our focal point in our plots. Yeah, this is just simple vegetation, who's there and then what frequencies are what we're seeing on this set of figures.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. One interesting part of your presentation was the use of data from remote sensing, which seems really useful. Are there limitations, though, to the remotely sensed data sets for addressing the questions that are important to DoD?
Yeah, those are really powerful data because of the scale they cover and the frequency. And so they open up a lot of opportunities, but we really need to think about what we can and can't derive from them when we do this sort of work. And so we don't really we get very limited information about species in the plant world from remotely sensed data. There are some species that really pop out and have signatures that allow us to see what they are, and new products, new remotely sensed products are going to open up even more opportunity there. But the Landsat record, the really old one, is at about a 30 meter resolution. And so what species are present and especially at the herbaceous and lower stature level is really hard to distinguish. So there's a lot of ground truthing that goes into that. And also those old metrics have some trouble dealing with bare ground, and drylands have a decent to high amount of bare soils or biocrusted soils that can really complicate pulling measurements from some of those layers. So there are limits in that regard, and that's where on the ground work like these experiments or other people's long-term data sets become very critical, and we've been lucky to be able to rely upon those.
Great, thank you. Next, did you see climate change or the long droughts resulting in flash flooding if there's a sudden downpour? And if so, how did that flash flooding affect the responses?
Yeah, so that did occur, not in our experimental plots, because thinking forward, we selected areas with almost zero slope to work on, in big part for that reason. We did see it happen around our locations where we're working. The translocation of material in those floods can be very large. And so I can just use for the example of that tangential experiment I described, whether you occur in soil from near a shrub or out in an interspace, that gets to be much more complicated if you're working on a steep slope because soils can move around quite a bit. So translocation of resources on this as soil erodes and gets deposited is a big issue in these systems. And then also that hydrophobic chemical layer that can build up to lead to ponding of water on the surface after those droughts can affect the degree of how much of that water becomes resource before it gets evaporated out. So we've observing those dynamics and we're interested in them. We were intentionally controlling by picking a certain relief to keep our plots on to try to eliminate them from complicating our life. But we have seen localized changes in soil level. We have erosion bridges installed. I didn't mention that. So we are tracking erosion in our plots. And there has been some substantial soil movement even on relatively flat surfaces. So it's a great question, and it's something that we need to work through in a more data-driven way with our own data set that we just haven't yet had time to really put that energy into.
Understood. Okay, thank you, Scott. We'll move towards wrapping up the webinar with a couple of broader questions. The first is for you, Scott, and then we have one for Sasha. Scott, you showed field experiments that had relatively small scale. How can those small scales help in our understanding of changes that are occurring at very large scales, far beyond that localized area?
Yeah, always, it's a great question, and it's always something we deal with when we're logistically constrained to experimentation at these scales. And I think the shortest, most pithy answer is that while we have large scale data like the Landsat record or large climate station records and gas flux records, we need the on the ground, hands-on localized work if we really want to test the mechanisms that drive the patterns in the data that we get from those other platforms. And so the small scale experiments benefit us by letting us state a hypothesis and test it and try to really dig in to measure and quantify what's driving variability in our response, right? So that's what we're on the ground doing. And if we do this in conjunction with people that work at those bigger data scales, like we've been trying to do in our group, we have found that there's a nice pathway to turn that localized work on that smaller scale into something that can greatly inform what people working with remote sensing and Earth system models are doing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. And Sasha, we'll have you come back on the line. And there's one last question for you. Can you tell from the work you've done so far whether land managers at Department of Defense facilities might need new ways to manage the lands in the face of climate change?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think a lot of the frameworks can be the same and the ideas about what matters can be the same, but in these landscapes that really are changing, I think we're going to have to be creative, and that some of our management solutions will need to be outside the traditional box. And I think that offers us new opportunities as well as facing these challenges. I think that DoD managers can really be at the forefront of managing for the use and the preservation of the system at the same time, even in the face of these changes, but it will require new tools. And that's part of what we're trying to develop for our manager partners.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. And at this time, I'd like to thank both of our presenters today. Thank you for the excellent presentations and for answering the questions. Our next webinar on Thursday, December 15th, and that will be on modeling and monitoring tools to support passive and active NAPL remediation approaches. Registration is open for this webinar as well as other webinars, so please visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register. And before we conclude, I want to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation from today will be on the webinar webpage in case you want to refer to them in the future. And we would appreciate it if at this time you could take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you.